Hello and welcome back to the EDHRECast. I'm Matt Morgan, and I am joined once again by my friend who I asked him what he listened to in the 90s, music-wise, and he said it was all garbage. It's Dana Roach.
I did listen to a lot of garbage. You are not wrong.
What's going on, Dana?
I've been helping my son with a little bit of summer homework he's got from some classes he's taking, and I can, some of it's all right. I can tolerate the algebra. The calculus isn't bad, but geometry is where I draw the line.
Oh, that one I was always bent out of shape with geometry. I just couldn't get it right.
In different directions. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Dana, I'm glad that you are here, have a little conversation. You and I were talking about something behind the scenes. We figured, again, let's just make this an actual episode.
Right.
Dana, what was that conversation about?
We're talking about so you changed your deck. Now what?
Yeah, absolutely. So Joey's not here this week, but that doesn't mean we don't have a great episode for you. So real quick, before we get into talking about the now what's, let's get some shout outs out of the way and into the main episode.
First of all, we are very excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. Products that you actually like using are easy to recommend, and we've been using Ultimate Guard sleeves and deck boxes for years. Joey's not here right now, and frankly, we're not really sure where he's at, which is a little bit worrying. But one thing that makes us feel better is knowing that his cards are sleeved up in Ultimate Guard katanas, and his decks are all locked up in rock-solid boulders. So while we don't really know what may have happened to Joey, fingers crossed he's okay, we're pretty sure his decks and cards will be fine. So thank you, Ultimate Guard, for that little peace of mind.
I mean, I have a theory. He could be lost in one of those Omni hives.
Sure, they are huge.
If you need some deck storage, Omni hives are massive. They're so handy to have around, fit in a backpack. Joey might have gotten lost in one of those, just the canyons to store all your cards.
Well, like all their products, we can't recommend the Omni hives and the sleeves and the boxes enough. So Ultimate Guard, thank you very much.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking this video, subscribing on YouTube, subscribing to local podcast apps. It's just free ways that we really appreciate. It helps us out so much by doing those things. But if you are so moved, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels as a nice way of saying thank you for financial support. Whether you want to join our Discord community, you want free swag, we do send out at a certain tier. We'll send out merch twice a year at a certain level. So if you want to get that or more, head to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where you can get all of those, or you can get signed up for the weekly patron shout out, which is what Zachary Queen did. That's a real Queen move, the highest of high moves, to go to patreon.com/EDHRECast.
Yes, Queen.
Yes, if Joey were here, Dana, I'm sure he would say, yes, Queen.
Yes.
So thank you, Zachary.
He will be very upset that I was the person that did that and not him.
Probably. But either way, Zachary, thank you so much for the support. We definitely appreciate it. And with that, Dana, let's ask ourselves the questions. So you change your deck. Now what do you do once you make these overhaul type of sweeping changes to the decks? And first off, why would you change your deck?
Yeah, and to be clear, we're talking about a big holistic change here, not, because we just recently talked about how tough it is to make upgrades. We're talking about some big overall change, not just swapping out cards, but something that changes what the deck looks like. And for example, one of the things that I think people do is they change their commanders. And that can impact what happens in the deck. It doesn't always. A real easy one, maybe you want to change Tatyova, Benthic Druid to AC of Tyrant of Gyre Straits, or the inverse of that, whatever. They're basically the same card. AC costs 1 mana more, and it's a 5/5 versus Tatyova is a 3/3 for 1 mana less. So maybe you found that in your particular meta, you need to get that card out faster, so you've moved from AC to Tatyova. Maybe in your meta, you can go a little bit slower and you want the larger body, so you found that moving from Tatyova to AC is a better move. And that probably doesn't change how your deck is built, but it can, have you force you to make other changes down the line. So we're looking at things like that, larger wholesale changes to what a deck looks like.
Yeah, and I think another example too, that we'll get to more of this later, but changing the theme of a deck sometimes is another way you can make super sweeping changes. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about how sometimes a set comes out and it gives a lot of support to something you're trying to do. And so that oftentimes can maybe sway you from doing one certain theme or strategy to another. If you're playing Atraxa, for example, who is kind of infamous for being able to go in many different ways, whether how you want to build the deck, say a set comes out and it kind of enables you to do something completely different, that's another very, very valid reason you would want to make sweeping changes to the deck. And both of those categories, I think there's a lot to unpack there. So let's go one by one. And I think that's probably the best way to do it as far as how we get to talk about it. So Dana, say you want to change commanders on a deck. You have a deck that exists already, but you want to change the commanders. What is your first thought when you make a change like that? Like, maybe do you have any examples from you doing this recently?
So the most recent big one I did was when Glissa Sunseeker came out. I had a Glissa the Trader deck that I've had forever, and I switched that commander from Glissa the Trader, First Strike Death Touch commander, and Glissa the Trader has a baked-in ability. Whenever a creature one of your opponent's controls dies, you can return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. Glissa Sunseeker also has a First Strike Death Touch, but has a couple of abilities that trigger when you deal combat damage. You can destroy an enchantment, you can draw a card and lose a life, which I'm a huge fan of, or you can remove some counters from one of your opponent's creatures. The reason I made that change was it was a deck I've had it forever, but it was built around doing Death Touch stuff. And in addition to that, because of that Glissa ability, I was doing a lot of things with artifact recursion as well. The problem was those two themes were kind of fighting for space in the deck, and it didn't play as smoothly as I would like. So when I switched to Glissa Sunseeker, I didn't feel like I had to devote a certain amount of slots in that deck to doing the artifact recursion stuff. And then that freed me up to kind of focus more on what I had wanted to be doing, which was with the Death Touch theme with the deck.
Yeah, and oftentimes too, I know that you've had that deck for forever, like you mentioned, but it really did seem like you're trying to square peg, round hole, that type of situation where, you can do artifact recursion or you can do Death Touch, but it's really hard doing both at the same time.
Yes.
It's really interesting that you say that because, it lets you devote specifically to both strategies and trying to kind of force both of them into one deck.
Yeah. And, so in this case, I make that change and then you swap out Glissa Sunseeker. Okay. And then I look at the list. I'm like, oh, okay, well, Mishra's Bauble is not a very good card if you're not playing it 6 times in a game. So the Mishra's Bauble and the Urza's Bauble come out and well, then I'm going to have to find something that's going to be my card draw effects in those slots. And so it wound up being, that switch of commanders and the removal of one of those themes. I probably changed a quarter or so of the deck, if not even more than that, pulling out things that were specifically designed to work with that artifact recursion theme and putting in things that didn't require that to function, along with maybe stuff that let me lean harder into the Death Touch theme.
So what types of changes were you able to make to the pre-existing deck? When you started to flesh out the artifact sub-theme a little bit more, what kind of freedom did you kind of have when you weren't trying to do two things at once?
One of the things I had wanted to do with the deck was I wanted to have more lure effects. Everything is Death Touch, and you can put something that forces your opponents to block a creature. Well, that can be very beneficial. Number one, it lets you poke damage through. Number two, all the stuff blocking is going to die.
Yeah.
But it was really difficult to find slots to run multiple effects that did that when I was also having to devote a bunch of slots to the artifact sub-theme. So it let me, by pulling out that one sub-theme that didn't necessarily interact well, the two didn't really work together, I could put in that lure sub-theme that actually does work in a logical way with having a lot of Death Touch stuff. So it just let me put in other cards that worked well with supporting the primary theme of the deck versus having a sub-theme that didn't really have any interaction with Death Touch.
I mean, I get that. And so I've had a similar experience recently. So I had a Trisonic Discordant deck for a long time. It was my Selesnya, probably one of the longer decks that I've had as far as just, it's been put together for a long time. It's made a lot of changes. It was Mirri Weatherlight Duelist for a while. Then I found myself putting a lot of ETB effects in there. So it kind of became a Panharmonicon deck. So I finally just pulled the trigger and switched over to Emil the Blessed because I was really there's no reason not to at this point. The deck is powerful enough that it's not a fun deck to play with just a super casual focus. So I figured,
sure,
let's just lean into it and kind of take it all the way. And so switching commanders was kind of the next step for me with that deck. And that led to cascading changes and let me to kind of focus the deck a little bit more, kind of like what you were noticing with both your decks. You split one deck into two. and you were able to kind of focus and flesh out those themes a little bit better. 100% what I experienced too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how that works when you make those commander switches. You, like I said, talking about the cascading changes, and when you do that and you start looking at like all the stuff that impacts, okay, I've swapped this commander out. Well, this commander has different mana requirements. So to go back to this Glissa deck, for example, when I had 30 or so artifacts in that deck, I could afford to have way more utility lands because so much stuff made like just required colorless mana to be cast that it was way easier to have utility lands in the deck that helped with something I was doing, but like just made colorless mana. Yeah. Because my requirements for colored mana were way lower. Well, once I made that swap over to Glissa Sunslayer, well, that wasn't the case anymore. All those artifacts came out. I was down to, half a dozen or so, and my colored mana requirements became much heavier. So then I had to pull a bunch of those utility lands out and put in a bunch of lands that just made colored mana so I could more consistently make sure I had the mana I wanted to have. So, the changes that flow into a change, which causes a change, which causes a change. It's really easy to miss, particularly when you like first start making that change. I'm just gonna swap these two things around and that will be it. That's very rarely it.
That never happens.
Knocks over dominoes.
Yeah, well, and so for me, the dominoes were, I changed Emil, and that deck, it used to kind of revolve, because like I said, it was my Panharmonicon deck, and that deck was super important because I wasn't playing very many flicker effects at all. And so I really knew that like that one trigger I was going to get when that creature came in, like that was the only one I was going to get. So making sure I got the most value out of that with a Panharmonicon, with the new Elish Norn that doubles my triggers there, those cards were super important because I needed to maximize the only trigger I was going to get. I was only ever going to get one Crater Hoof Behemoth trigger, or whatever it was going to look like. Whereas now I know I'm going to get those triggers more often with Emil being in the command zone. So that just opened up so much more. So now instead of, I'm only ever going to get this one, so I have to have Panharmonicon, it's, I'm going to get it more. So why not just play more support cards to find more ETB triggers? So like Guardian Project, for example, shot up in priority because that's letting all my non-token creatures enter. None of them are going to have the same name ever, but I'm going to get those draw triggers on there. And that's what is going to be powering me through versus, I have to make sure this one shot counts.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the Guardian Project is a good example. Like, if you are playing a version of that deck that has, 18 creatures or something in it, well, am I going to get enough draw effects off Guardian Project to make it, to justify it? Oh, maybe not. Well, when you switch that deck to an Emil and you're doing blink stuff, well, 18 creatures is a whole different deal when they're going to be coming in out of the battlefield with blink effects repeatedly. So like the math on a lot of that stuff changes because of how the card works. Now, if that was a cast effect, that wouldn't change anything, but it's not. It's an ETB and you're doing blink stuff. So the synergy, the things that synergize with the deck in this current version are different than the ones that synergize with it before.
Yeah, and I feel like it kind of freed me up just because of the nature of Emil. Like I said, taking the pressure off the one trigger I was ever going to get, I could diversify so much more. I didn't need 3 copies of Reclamation Sage type of effects anymore because I knew that once I find it, I can kind of repeat it as I need to. So I was able to put a lot more fun stuff in there. I got to put Conclave Sledge Captain into play. I got to put Cemetery Prowler, like those more support cards. So I was able to diversify the fun because I don't need to always make sure I'm getting that one. I can get the one and then repeat that a little bit more. That was significantly easier to do. And just, it felt, I don't know if Dana, if you've experienced this, but it felt freeing almost because,
absolutely.
Okay, now I can put a little more fun cards in there. I don't have to do just the one and really find that one effect every time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I went from this Glissa the Trader deck that I love, but I could never quite get it to feel the way I wanted it to feel for the most part.
Yeah.
And when I didn't just change commanders, I functionally split it into 2. I made Glissa the Sunslayer the Death Touch deck, and I kept Glissa the Trader and just did it entirely as an artifact recursion deck.
Sure.
So I can still do some of the fun stuff I wanted to do in that Glissa the Trader deck that I enjoyed with that without having to fight against the Death Touch theme and vice versa. And both of those decks are much more fun to play because I'm not dealing with the friction that comes with trying to do 2 disparate things in a single deck.
Well, I like what you said there, Dana. You got to do the things that you wanted to do to begin with. Like, okay, I made this deck with a purpose, and maybe get to trying to do too much. And so you kind of get away from that purpose that you set out with. It does feel like, okay, I changed this deck and, now I can kind of do what I really wanted to do when I started making all these changes to begin with. And I was just kind of like foot in the door, but foot out the door at the same time. And so now it's just, you're jumping into the deep end. And for me, I know you kind of feel the same way. That is more fun when you get to just dive in head first. Like, this is what I want to be doing with the deck. It's not a little bit of leftovers from a previous theme that I was trying to kind of carry out.
Another commander move I made at one point in time, this was probably 3 years ago now. I had a fling deck, and Kresh the Bloodbraided was the commander. So that was in Jund colors, a 3-color deck. And the way Kresh works, when a creature dies, you put counters on Kresh to make him stronger. Primarily, I was doing +1 counter stuff, so I would play creatures that ETB with +1 counters, and then double those counters, whatever, and then fling them for damage. The reason Kresh was the commander was the thought was, well, then that creature would die from the fling effect. It would make Kresh bigger, and I could eventually, fling Kresh to kill the last person.
Sure.
And that worked pretty well. A couple of the things I didn't like about it, though, 3-color decks are just like, unless you have a really good mana base, they get a little bit stickier in terms of, what you want to do. Particularly in this case, because I didn't have much, there wasn't much in the colors black that helped with what the deck was doing, aside from Kresh.
Yeah.
Now, if you have black, you're going to run some black spells, but like none of those spells were required to make the deck work.
Makes sense.
So I had to have a lot of black mana in the deck to make sure I could get Kresh out, but like I didn't use much of it beyond that. That felt just off to me. And when Minsc and Boo Timeless Heroes came out, it has kind of a fling effect as one of the abilities on the Minsc and Boo card. It was only in red and green, so I could drop black. So I'm like, I'm just going to try this out to see what the deck feels like playing it as a 2-color deck versus a 3-color deck.
Okay.
And I didn't actually have any long-term plans. I thought I was probably going to switch back to Kresh at some point. Again, it just played much more smoothly. By dropping the 3rd color and not having to worry about that, I always had the mana I wanted for the spells. And then it also let me do a few other things like, well, now I'm in 3 colors, I can run things like Vigor. That's a really good creature if you're doing +1 counter stuff.
Yeah.
That I was not comfortable playing something that required 3 green mana to cast in a 3-color deck. It was much more harder to hit. Well, that and Lifeblood Hydra cards that got easier to cast. So that changed things in terms of like just the colors in the deck and how those played.
Well, I think, you brought up a lot of really good points there. And first off, I really know you hate playing 3-color decks. So you feel like it just gives you access to too much anyways.
Yes. Yeah, just the mental workload of like, you know what, it's just less cards to worry about and like choose between that. Yeah, the decision paralysis went down quite a bit. Yeah.
Oh, and I really like... Yeah, the point of you smoothing out your mana, not just because, A, you don't have to worry about a 3rd color, but then it allows you to know I'm always going to have the mana to cast a Vigor. Vigor's a great card, but there's so many powerful cards out there that because we have so many 3-color commanders and just mana's so good, people kind of forget that, oh yeah, I can play this triple whatever color pip creature in my decks now. And because I'm only playing 2 colors, it's so much easier to cast those. I really love being able to dial back a little bit to play cards like that. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah. And I for maybe some people don't have the problems I sometimes have with like hitting trip colors in a single card. Because even in decks like this, I talked about removing utility lands from my Glissa deck. I still run plenty of utility lands to make colorless mana. So like for me personally, I maybe have a tougher time doing that than some people do. But it made it much easier when I went to a 2-color deck to cast those kind of fun cards that I felt like I couldn't comfortably cast in a different deck.
But then also when you think about it too, you talk about you cut black from the deck. It wasn't doing anything. It wasn't adding anything to the deck that couldn't be replaced. You think about like black with its draw spells. I know you love Night's Whisper, Sign in Blood, those types of cards. You have a lot of good options now in Gruul colors. You have like Ren's Resolve and those types of impulse draw cards that, you're still hitting everything. You're getting cards when you need them. And green, I mean, the past 5 years has just done everything anyways. So you don't really need black in as far as like shoring up weaknesses. You have plenty of removal in red. You have plenty of removal in green too. So like you're not really losing a whole lot. And I think that maybe the pendulum in general, I know this applies to you specifically in this conversation, but players in general, maybe the pendulum swings back where people kind of draw back on colors because, well, we're getting so much support for being able to do things in 2 colors now, and every color is a little more fleshed out with weaknesses.
Right.
Maybe that starts happening a little bit more in general with the player base.
Yeah, I don't remember my thought process when I first built that Crash deck, but it's entirely possible. Like, I've had it for a lot of years. It's entirely possible at the time I mentally was like, well, by adding black, I will make up for the lack of like card draw in red. Because there was definitely way less back then, whereas that's less of a weakness today. You can much more easily play something in the 2 colors where 1 color is red and not feel like you're going to be scrambling for card draw. Red just has so much more.
Well, I mean, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, you don't need Outpost Siege as your one and only copy of being able to impulse draw every turn. You get a lot of effects like that nowadays. And there's a lot of just ways, I think, in general, every color has kind of been able to dial back from that. So you can cut a color and you're not really losing all that much. Maybe the most efficient versions of that effect, but you still have copies of that you're still going to be able to play in any given deck, and you're going to have a density of those because, especially like red and white with card draw, like gone are the days of, 2015, Boros sucks in Commander because of whatever. Like, that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, as the face of the game changes and the amount of cards get added to it that alter kind of the larger meta, that changes our decks and how our decks play and how we have to go about building them. And it's an easy thing to forget in the moment because it's such a like slow change over time that it's very easy to kind of lose track of what might have been true regarding color strengths and weaknesses 3 or 4 or 5 years ago isn't necessarily still true today.
Yeah, well, and changing the commanders for that, I feel like that you get all these new options. You get a new version of some commander, and maybe it's in different colors, and so you have the deck, but it stays in soul the same, but maybe you change color. Maybe you drop green and you add blue instead, or for whatever reason. I think we're getting a lot of commanders just with the density of legendary creatures we're getting in the game and the velocity that we're getting those. Like, just product is coming out faster than ever, but we're getting a lot of legends. And so I think players might be able to do this a little bit more for themselves. They're going to get a new legendary commander that, I mean, it's going to be the same strategy as they're playing, but maybe it's different colors. And so they might just change. That's a huge sweeping change. It's not going to change your mana base. It's going to change your support cards, how they're executed. There's a lot that's going to go into that, especially when you change colors.
Yeah, I mean, it might not even be like a thing where like you are actively looking to make a change. It can be a thing that WotC kind of drops on your doorstep. There were probably a lot of people out there who had Una, Queen of the Fae, black and blue fairy decks. And not that Una isn't a good commander, but like she's 6 mana and she takes a significant amount of mana pumped into her to start making like fairy tokens.
Yeah, the investment is huge.
Yeah, and I would bet there were a lot of people that like all of a sudden when those fairy decks came out, that black blue fairy deck came out in Eldraine about a year ago with multiple different commander options. Like, I can play something that maybe the play style is a little bit like less intensive. The commander isn't such kind of expensive and difficult thing to get out and get some use out of. And there was multiple different options then that came out in that set too. So like it wasn't just like there was a new black blue fairy option. There was like 3 or 4 and you could probably pick one that fit your personal play style or your meta better maybe than Una did.
Well, and same thing happened for me. I used to have, it was a Muldrotha +1/+1 counters deck. And just because I wanted to play all the cool Sultai, because, we had Simic that always got a lot of +1/+1 counter support. We got Golgari, which a lot of times also had +1/+1 counters kind of built into those identities of those colors. We never really had a good blue, black, and green commander all at the same time. And so finally, when Ukima and Khazur came out, when that pre-constructed deck back in Ikoria came out, I was so happy because that finally gave me an excuse to kind of play the strategy that I wanted within the colors that I was already trying to force. Because like it was fine. Like Muldrotha was looking back, it was a really lazy pick for me because it just kind of did everything. But like I finally had a home, and so I didn't even have to change the colors in the deck, but the strategy definitely changed because all of a sudden instead of having Muldrotha, which you can recur everything in your graveyard, I had to kind of get a little more creative with, okay, this is how I'm going to put counters onto my Ukima, and then I'm going to turn it sideways.
Right. Yeah. When you have Muldrotha there, you have this automatic, well, worst case, I can bring some back from my graveyard for value. It's kind of the Glissa situation I had where like you can very easily find yourself with multiple different teams fighting against one another in ways that cause a little bit of friction when you're playing that isn't necessarily, like maybe that is fun for you, but for me that isn't. I like the deck to function much more smoothly and have everything complement one another versus like fighting against one another a little bit.
Yeah, and that was, it just opened up so many cool things too, because sometimes, Dana, if you're just putting all your eggs in the basket with Glitz of the Trader, there's a lot of graveyard synergy, it folds over. Well, suddenly having this other deck, these other commanders in the command zone for me, that weakness was gone. Like, yes, opened up other weaknesses that I maybe traditionally, like, personally enjoy playing against a little bit more. I know the weaknesses with creature-based decks, and so I can plan around that. I wasn't a graveyard player. I know Joey is, but Joey's not here, so I can say, like, I'm not a huge graveyard player.
Sure.
So I was able to find something that is, again, the colors were the same. The strategy was the same, but the weaknesses had shifted to something I personally am more at home fighting against. And that was just, for me, again, like you said, Dana, it plopped in my lap. It was just, oh, this is perfect for what I was trying to do anyways. Thank you.
It's perfect for what you wanted to do, and it simultaneously kind of like worked with your strengths as a brewer and a player, and like what you wanted to do.
Yeah, but then also, like, there still was a lot of fun space to brew, though. Like, Anna Sanctuary. That's a card that, Dana, you mentioned years and years ago, was finally a place I could play that. And it makes my Ukima huge and get to do things every turn.
And sometimes things like that are reason enough to make that commander change. Like, if I switch to this, I can run these cool cards, this cool piece of interaction that I've wanted to play for years and haven't had a home for it. And like, sometimes that is reason enough to make that switch. Yeah,
and again, I know we're kind of drilling home this example, but I wouldn't have ever played Astarion's Thirst if Muldrotha was still the commander. Like, it's a one-shot thing. Why would I not be playing something I could just maximize with the commander versus I only want one thing. I only want this effect once, because oftentimes it's enough to kill players sometimes, and that's all you need.
Sometimes, though, the change isn't just commander-based. Like, you're changing the larger theme of the deck. Maybe the commander stays the same, but the kind of roadmap the deck is taking takes a pretty big swing. And I think after we do some challenge of stats here, we can come back and talk about that.
Yeah, that works for me. So let's challenge some stats real quick and get back to it.
My challenge this week was sent to us by listener Blake the Red, and it's for Don Andreas the Renegade decks. Don Andreas Renegade is a 4-mana Grixis commander, a 4/3 vampire pirate, and it says each creature you control but don't own gets +2/+2 and has menace and death touch, and is a pirate in addition to its other types. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell you don't own, create 2 tapped treasure tokens. 2 of the most popular cards in Don Andreas Renegade decks are Mob Rule and Insurrection that let you take control of, in the case of Insurrection, all of your opponent's creatures. In the case of Mob Rule, all the creatures with a mana value 3 or lower or 4 or higher from all your opponents. And those are both in about 50% of decks. But one similar spell I think people have missed out on is Call for Aid from Lord of the Rings set. It's in just 15% of Don Andreas decks. And the reason I even got looking at this in the first place is I have Call for Aid in my Agnes deck, and I cast it fairly recently on someone, and they mentioned that, oh, I didn't know that was actually a thing. That would be really good in my Don Andreas deck. And at the same time, we had gotten a suggestion from somebody pointing it out. So it just kind of drove home to me that this is a card that people just missed out on. And so suggestion here from Blake the Red. Blake, this is a good challenge, and it's a challenge that I actually have encountered recently in the wild. People just missed this card for taking all of someone's stuff till the end of the turn. If you're playing Don Andreas and you're running Insurrection and you're running Mob Rule, take a look at Call for Aid. It's a perfect fit for that deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Call for Aid just in general, I love that. Like, it's so good.
There's a ton of good cards from that Lord of the Rings set, and I think just because of the sheer velocity of cards coming out, I think people just have missed a lot of them, particularly ones that like aren't universally great but happen to work really well in a specific deck. So, Call for Aid is just an excellent card.
So, speaking of cards that I think people kind of miss, so I personally, Assassin's Creed, I know the games, but I never got super big into it. I know a lot of people were super excited about a lot of the characters, getting to see all these, folks that you've seen throughout a whole slew of games popping up and down. One card that it's not glamorous, it's kind of like Call for Aid. It's not a named character, and it's not a huge moment in the game, so people kind of overlook it. But from the Assassin's Creed set, Battlefield Improvisation is a card that, Dana, you and I were talking about it, and I just love it so much. I'm going to steal it from you as a challenge. So I'm not sorry, but yeah. So Battlefield Improvisation is 1 and a white for an instant that says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Whatever. If that creature is attacking, though, you may attach any number of equipment you control to it. So there's a couple really important things that are going on here that A, I understand why you like it so much, but B, I think it's just an amazing card. So it doesn't specify creatures you control. So you can take Battlefield Improvisation, you can slap it onto another creature, and it's going to be all the equipment that you control. So I have an Arden and Ketis deck. You have Arden and Essior, two very equipment-heavy strategies. Mm-hmm. This card is perfect for anybody that's playing any of those. If you're playing more than like 15 equipments in a deck, this is fantastic because you can say, Dana, you're attacking Joey for not being here. I can cast Battlefield Improvisation and put 4 equipment onto a creature, and I'm going to get all those triggers. So say we have Sword of Feast and Famine, we have a Sword of Fire and Ice. You're going to get those triggers too. There's just so much to like here. I love this card. I automatically put like 5 copies onto my card sphere want list. Hopefully those show up soon because I'm just, this card has so much going on. It's kind of a white tainted strike type of effect where you're beefing up the creature. You're going to maybe say it attacks before blockers. Oh, I'm going to cast this. I'm going to equip a Whisper Silk Cloak on it. So it can't be blocked now. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of play. This card is just fantastic. It's only in 802 total decks right now. And again, I think just being in a very, very big and popular set, but it's not really a popular card, it's going to slip through a lot of cracks. So if folks out there need a good recommendation for an equipment-heavy deck, this is a combat trick that's going to save your creature for one, but also two, it's a political tool, and we love those over here on this show. So it's something that people, once they see it once, they're going to look over their shoulder. They're going to be worried about, okay, do I want to block this thing that's attacking me? Because Matt's got a lot of equipment on his battlefield. Absolutely fantastic card. Dana, thanks for finding this, and also thanks for letting me steal this from you, challenging it in the future, because I'm very excited about this card. This is fantastic.
I'm gonna get hit with this at some point, and that's perfectly okay.
We all are. Yeah. Well, let's segue out. Yeah. Let's get back to the show. So Dana, you had mentioned not just changing commanders is going to make sweeping changes to a deck. Sometimes you can change that theme that you're doing, keeping the commander the same, but you're changing the way the deck functions. You, I'm sure, have tons of experience doing this. So why don't you take us through the thought process of you doing this in one of your decks?
Sure. And again, I think this can happen multiple ways. Like maybe you're playing a deck with a certain theme and you're like, oh, this just like isn't working right. It's not fast enough. It's not efficient enough. It doesn't do the thing enough. I need to find another theme, another thing for my deck to do that will work better. Maybe it's causing problems with people, like people just don't enjoy whatever the theme you've got working your deck, so you want to switch it up there. For me, the thing that I think happens most frequently is I'll build a deck with a plan in mind, and then once I actually start playing the deck with people, I will realize, oh, this deck works a little bit differently than I realized.
Sure.
An example of this, I have an Agnes, the Dragon's Lash deck that's mono red. I really didn't know what I wanted to do with the deck other than, this would be kind of funny to make this as a mono red deck. Since the mana costs are all hybrid, I could do that. That would make it look a little bit different than most Agnes decks. I'll run a bunch of creatures with haste because obviously that makes sense in that deck, and then see what happens from there. One of the things I found pretty quickly was being able to take people's creatures with things like Call to Aid that we talked about before, or Insurrection, gives me hasty creatures beyond what I was able to put on the board just with my own cards. Mm-hmm. And putting in one of those effects made me realize how much I wanted 2, which is how much I wanted 3. So like eventually I got to the point where this deck now has probably 6 variants on like Insurrection or Mass Mutiny or Call for Aid as a sub-theme in that deck. And I didn't really realize I wanted to do that until I tested out one card and saw how effective it was. Mm-hmm. So then I began to like tweak the rest of the deck to work with that sub-theme.
Well, isn't it funny that you play one card and it has such a profound impact on how that specific game was played out? You want just more copies of that. It's not, obviously, yes, everybody wants removal, everybody wants card draw, but it's random cards like that, like an Insurrection type of effect where a mob rule, I really like this. I want more of that in the deck.
And then you talked about cascading changes before. Well, once I realized that I wanted multiple of these effects in the deck, then the deck went from needing, 20 5 to 27 creatures in it to really like function the way I wanted to, like, oh, I can get away with running 20 or 21 and running a bunch of these mass theft effects, and I didn't need as many of those as I took out creatures. So then it freed up other slots in the deck to put in a little more card draw, a little more whatever. So that's how these kind of like large scale changes in decks work sometimes. It just worked better in a bunch of ways because it kind of freed up slots in the deck to run other things that kind of lubricated how the deck functions.
Well, and two, I mean, you went from big focus on hasty creatures. A lot of times those creatures are smaller or they're doing something, they're sneaking by.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're doing Insurrection's not a cheap spell to cast.
Right.
And so I'm sure it changed a lot of your mana requirements. You maybe looked at, okay, well, I need to add another piece of ramp because I reliably need to get to 6-7 mana, whatever. Mm-hmm. Because, again, all of these mass theft type of cards, 5 mana is really cheap for that type of effect.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So then I'm like, okay, how do I survive to this point? And then I went through the process. Well, okay, now do I want sack outlets in this deck? So like when I take people's stuff, I can like, throw it all to an Agent Ultra or something then afterwards so they don't get it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I discovered that that wasn't worth doing for me, but I tinkered with it a little bit to see if that was something I wanted to consider. And I found that I couldn't devote enough slots in the deck to reliably have it available to me. So I didn't. I've pulled those cards out, but like that would have been another large scale change. And if I would have made that change, if I'm running a bunch of sack outlets, well, then do I want to run something else that synergizes with having a bunch of sack outlets? So like the dominoes really can start falling in a whole lot of ways once you make these kind of theme changes.
I can suddenly see why you have that big Charlie Kelly murder board of,
right.
Well, if I do this, exactly. Then it goes to this, and
yeah.
like how connected the lines get. You're absolutely right, though. Like you make one change, okay, well that inspires me to make another change. Over the course of, a couple months of playing a deck, that's going to make huge differences in how the deck plays, anything like that. And maybe it's something gradual that you were making, or for me, like I just wanted almost a rebrew, for example. I have a Taste of Karlov deck, and it had the Aristocrats, Death Triggers type of synergy there, and that was fine, but it also kind of turned into the same type of deck as everybody else was playing. I want to do something a little bit different while still playing into the strengths of the deck, and I know that Taste of Karlov doubles the death triggers. Taste of Karlov has another ability, folks. It does give your creatures vigilance and life, or your creature tokens, vigilance and lifelink. Well, that was a absolutely powerful and super viable strategy. And at the time, I didn't have a dedicated tokens deck, so I was able to shift it. But that was 40 cards that changed instantly. Like there were still some support cards that stuck around, but that was huge sweeping changes from an Aristocrats deck to a tokens deck.
Yeah, when you make that kind of a wide change, again, if you're playing tokens, that can consist of things like Anointed Procession, maybe, or you're running a Cathar's Crusade that's going to buff all those tokens up. And if you're not playing in that style, you don't need a bunch of those things either. And what are you going to replace those with? So yeah, there's just so many dominoes that can fall over making that kind of a change in a deck like Teysa.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't even just like a lot of the support cards got to stick around because of whatever reason. Like the very few are cards that happen to still be good, but I also need to play more protection because it used to be like, okay, I'm playing Blood Artist, I'm playing Zulaport Cutthroat, all those effects. Mm-hmm. I don't care if my stuff dies. Well, now that I have to win through combat damage, that's the primary way that I'm going to be able to kill people. And so it was, okay, I can't rely on just having a Blood Artist and being okay with a board wipe happening. I had to play a bunch of protection pieces, so I wasn't playing Boromir, Warden of the Tower, for example, because I didn't mind if everything blew up. Now I do. Now I had to play a bunch of types of cards to protect it, and then I still had to make tokens. That was the main thing, is that you have to re-overhaul the entire strategy when you're making these types of changes. It's
one of those things that I think is very rewarding. Like I really enjoy figuring out how the deck works and like solving that puzzle. I'm like, oh, okay, this wasn't quite right, but I made this tweak and everything is better. And now like I'm going to focus in that direction and like make a bunch more changes to keep things moving that way. But I get how that can be frustrating too. And like you build a deck and like I want it to do this thing, and it's wanting to do something else. The deck is like pushing me in a direction that I was not planning on going, and that can be pretty frustrating too. I can absolutely see how you wouldn't like that.
Yeah, it got to be like I was already kind of incidentally doing a few of these things already. But I got to play the other important half of Bastion of Remembrance. Instead of worrying about whenever a creature you control dies, I'm worrying about making the tokens. And you're right. Mm-hmm. The obvious cards kind of get slotted in, but then the cards that aren't obvious, those also are ones that I'm like, oh, I don't really want some of these random cards, but I do want maybe an EDHRECast again, because I'm going to make all the tokens. Mm-hmm. I'm still going to be able to sacrifice them for whatever reason, but it was a chance to, okay, Nadier's Nightblade, I'm going to rely on Tace's Death Trigger to double those up. I don't need to double those up when I have 20 creatures on the battlefield, and I can just have those all go ham anyways.
A larger theme change I had with the deck was when I moved my mono black Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose deck to Tavash Gloom Summoner. Mm-hmm. Vito kind of works as half of like a Sanguine Bond, Exquisite Blood combo. And that was the main reason I made that move. People like assumed I was going for the combo, and that's not really what I was trying to do with the deck. It was just easier to move to a different life gain commander than have that conversation every single time. But what I then found when I made that switch over to Tavash, the way Tavash works, you gain life at the end of your turn. You can spend the life you gained to make an XX demon. So if you gain 20 life, you make a 20 demon. But you lose that 20 life you gained too. And I really then found that I enjoyed that play style better. It wasn't a situation where you were getting a ton of life and not really doing anything with it other than like be tough to kill. You were getting the life, but you had to then make the determination, do I want to spend this making a offensive creature, but make myself vulnerable because I didn't keep any of that life I gained. And then once I started doing that, okay, I'm making these demons in this deck. Well, now I have things I can sacrifice if I need to black sacrifice effect. And like that, the face of that deck changed by about 40 cards. And I didn't think it was really going to do that. I made that initial swap, and that swap changed the entire theme of the deck. And it's one of those things I didn't even really realize that was going to be the case until I started playing that deck.
Yeah, the unintended consequences of updating the decks and updating the themes, it absolutely plays such an impact and influences the decisions that you make from there. So you make a couple changes, like you said, Dana. What direction do I want to take this? Do I want to take it offensive or defensive? You have to kind of be constantly reevaluating, okay, I changed this, now what? So it's not even a case of, so you changed your deck. It's like, I changed a card, and that can make huge impact on the rest of the deck and how it flows from there. I mean, you've always kept an Excel sheet. You change a card, but then that changes this, and then it changes this, and it becomes this decision tree almost of here's the direction that the deck is going.
And what's interesting about it too, and Joey and I did a show recently, one of the ones that you weren't on, where we talked about like the kind of threats and the power stuff that decks present, and like how that can maybe be detrimental sometimes if your commander looks very threatening. Mm-hmm. In this case, honestly, if I would sit down with that Vito deck, everyone's reaction was to assume it was going to be half of a Blood Bond combo, and they were much more threatened by it. Even if I assured them the combo wasn't there,
oh yeah,
it still presented as a much stronger deck than it really was. Vito didn't do that much in the actual deck. Having switched to Tavash, that deck is much stronger. Making 20/20 demons with evasion is very threatening in a way that Vito absolutely wasn't. But the perception is it's not as strong.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's just such a weird thing. By changing that deck, I made the deck more powerful, while at the same time making it perceived to be less powerful.
Yeah, that is such a you thing to do, too. Like, I'm taking away the obvious threat because I'm going to play something just half a step down. It's not even like you're playing a weaker version of it, but you're playing something that just isn't as threatening, and that alone allows you to win more games just because you're not the target. And it was an absolute yes. If listeners out there, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, give it a go, because it is such a great conversation of how do I manage the threat assessment for myself. It's not assessing who at the table is a threat, is how do I make myself just appear to be less of a threat without actually making myself less of a threat. And it's such a fine line to walk.
Yeah, and I think it's a very valuable thing to do in a deck too, is to present yourself as being a little bit less scary than you actually are. So yeah, that wasn't the intended plan with that deck, but it worked out that way. And actually, Matt, I would wager that has happened with you sometimes too, that Emil deck probably looks a little bit less scary than Tristani does.
I don't know. Emil has the reputation of being
at this point,
a pretty
it's kind
powerful.
Of a combo. That's true. Yeah,
and it's not like I'm playing, unicorn typo with honorary unicorns or anything like that.
Sure, that's true.
I'm embracing that, and for me, it was a little bit of the opposite effect. Actually, like the deck was playing above its weight class when you look at the commander, and so at that point, it was. People who know me, people in my play group that I play with consistently, they're kind of like, well, we know what you're going to do, so we're going to like give you a little bit more attention. And so it was more a case of, I need to change my commander because I need to put the commander that's going to fall in line with what the rest of the deck is doing. Whereas, sometimes people will say like, oh, it's not that Vanifar deck or whatever it is.
Right.
Like it's always that Vanifar deck. It's always that type of deck. It was more like, oh no, it is that deck, and so now I need a commander that's going to kind of fall in line with being that deck. And
sure,
that was such a weird thing because normally it's different. People downplay the powers. Like it was more, I need to accept like this deck has grown into a little bit of a problem, and so now I need to just embrace it instead of denying it, kind of like what I had been doing for a little bit.
Sure. If you're playing a strong deck and everyone already knows it's a strong deck, then why not play a strong commander to go with the strong deck versus playing the weaker commander? Just embrace it. No, I get that. That makes sense.
Yeah, committing to the bit. And Danny, this is something you do a lot, is like, here's my thing. I'm going to commit. I'm not going to like tiptoe around it. I'm going to dive in head first. That was me just taking that next step with that deck. And it maybe it was a little bit overdue because Emil's been out for a long, long time, but also like it's been a kind of a Panharmonicon ETB triggers centric deck for a while now. And so, yeah, it was more just me kind of delaying the inevitable of like, I want to pretend that it isn't really this type of deck, but it's a pretty tuned deck at this point where I know the ins and outs of it and I'm comfortable with where it's going. I just needed to put a commander in the zone that fell in line with that.
I guess to put a bow on all of this and kind of wrap it up,
sure.
I guess my thought would be, or the lesson to take away from this would be, if there's a deck out there that someone has that you're struggling with, or not even struggling necessarily, it just doesn't like feel the way you want it to feel, take a look at the possibility of either changing the commander to something that's very similar, maybe plays a little bit differently, or B, like actually changing the theme underneath that commander, even if the commander stays the same. Like, okay, if I swap out this one thing that I'm trying to do with the deck for something else, that might also like really change how it plays and how much you enjoy it. So like, don't necessarily give up on a deck right away. There are things you can do, whether it's change the commander or change the theme, that can really change how it plays in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think folks should be encouraged to kind of play what they want. And so sometimes I think players get the sunk cost fallacy in the back of their brain. Mm-hmm. I absolutely am just as jealous of that of, okay, well, I've put all this time and effort into making this deck work. Mm-hmm. And I get afraid to make the changes I kind of know that I need to make. And my Emil deck is kind of the same way. I knew I kind of needed to do this, but I was kind of just in my own stubbornness about, I want to make it work this way. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so I think players, if that's what you want to do, if you want to kind of commit to the challenge of it, that's absolutely fantastic. But I think some players get scared to take the leap, to make the sweeping changes to their decks because, well, I don't really know what else I would be doing. And that's totally fine. I think players should never be afraid to make sweeping changes to their decks if they think the version that the deck is in just isn't jiving with what they want to be doing.
One thing I like to do when I'm like experimenting with these kind of changes too is to use like Architect's playtest feature.
Oh yeah,
to just deal out sample hands and like then play out 6 or 8 turns. Like, okay, I've pulled out this little sub theme. I've pulled out these 15 cards and added these 15 cards, or I've swapped this commander out or whatever it is. Like you can actually digitally, without even having to buy your cards, just go test that out and get a feel for how it plays. And you'll be surprised. You can get a lot of information just doing that kind of thing.
Well, and the best thing about the Architect playtester is you can make whatever changes you want. You don't have to buy the cards in order to test them out when you're doing it all online. Mm-hmm. I think that's one thing that it's absolutely fantastic. It's kind of the undersold tool that comes to Architect is playtest everything. You can make a change, playtest it, make a change. That way you're not committed to buying all these new cards. You're not committed to spending money on the deck. And then you find out, well, like, oh, I don't really actually like the way that card plays. you can kind of save yourself a lot of that hassle by just playtesting. Just go to Architect, build the deck out, make whatever changes you want, and just playtest it. You can playtest against your friends. I know some folks have done that over Spell Table. Absolutely a fantastic way to, okay, I'm going to change 15 cards in the deck. That's a pretty significant impact. What does that look like when I play the deck?
Yeah, something I do all the time, the amount of decks I've cloned and then like made changes and played them through. I'm like, okay, that didn't work the way I wanted it to, or did, and you're like, oh, I'm interested in doing this. Let me keep this and keep now tinkering with this branch or this version of the deck and see where it goes. So yeah, it's awesome. Absolutely look at ways you can kind of evolve your deck versus giving up on it if it's not working the way you want it to work. Yeah,
I love it. Well, Dana, we got some parting shots in real quick. So with that said, let's wrap everything up. So before we sign off, where can everybody find you at online?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Matt Morgan. You can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you would like some of the best deck building accessories out there to protect all of your cards, check out Ultimate Guard. They're the best you can do. And also check out Joey. He's on social media as well, Joseph M. Schultz. And send us an email, EDHRECast@gmail.com. We would like to hear from you, listeners. If you have ways that you have made sweeping changes to your decks, whether it's change the commander, change the theme of the deck, we want to hear about it. So let us know in the comments, send us an email, when we look forward to all that and more. So with that said, Dana, I think we did a pretty good job. Joey's not here. I think we did a pretty good job.
Hopefully he's safe. Yeah,
hopefully
we'll be all right. We did all right.
We'll be all right. Yes, hopefully Joey gets out of that Omni Hive he's been hiding out in.
He's trapped in right now, yeah.
Yep, so we'll be good. So with that said, everybody, thank you so much. We'll see you next week. And don't forget, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.